Making Room for Peace. A Doctor's Guide to Gentle Aging. Part 1. A Doctor's Reflection on Letting Go. At 73, Dr. Helen Brooks had spent most of her life moving between hospital rooms and quiet living rooms, caring for patients at the edge of life. Her specialty wasn't glamorous. She worked in home healthcare and palliative support, the kind of medicine that required more listening than prescribing. After decades of sitting beside hospital beds, holding hands with people as they whispered final words or stared silently into a fading future, Helen had come to see aging not as a disease, but as a season, a time that could be deeply meaningful if only we made room for it. She lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Charlottesville, Virginia, where old oak trees shaded the quiet streets and birdsong marked the passing hours better than clocks. Her days had slowed, and while she still consulted part-time for a local hospice, Helen now spent more hours in her garden than in any clinical setting. She'd begun writing essays, recording the insights she had gathered from thousands of home visits. The one message that kept resurfacing again and again was this: growing old requires a kind of emotional and physical decluttering. A conscious letting go not of memories, but of burdens that no longer serve. It's not about erasing the past, Helen often told her clients and their families. It's about creating space for the present, and for whatever future we still have. That's what inspired her to begin documenting what she called the 8 essentials of decluttering in old age. These were not quick tips or minimalist slogans. They were hard-won lessons, drawn from real lives and quiet moments. And she had learned, too, that decluttering wasn't just about the things we throw away, but about what we choose to keep. Clearing the paper trail. Helen sat at her kitchen table, looking at the thick folder of papers she had pulled from her filing cabinet that morning. Bills from 10 years ago, old insurance forms, out-of-date medical pamphlets. Even she, a seasoned physician, had let them pile up over the years. I might need this one day, she had thought each time she slipped another paper into the drawer. But that day never came. She recalled one visit to a patient named Mr. Kramer, a retired teacher who had fallen and fractured his hip. His daughter had rushed over to help, but spent 2 hours sifting through paperwork to find his Medicare information and prescription list. The hospital needed it right away, she'd said, nearly in tears. I couldn't find anything. Helen had seen how a stack of disorganized papers could quickly become a crisis, so she began with her own files. Her rule was simple: only keep the latest version of a document. One folder for health records, one for insurance, one for personal documents, and clearly labeled. Everything else went into the recycling bin. She didn't feel loss. She felt relief. Reclaiming the closet. One rainy afternoon, Helen opened the doors to her bedroom closet. The smell of lavender sachets floated up, along with the memory of years gone by. She saw the sequin dress she had worn to her retirement party, the jacket from her medical school graduation, and at least a dozen blouses she hadn't worn in years. Some were too tight, others had sleeves too long, and a few simply didn't feel like her anymore. She touched the fabric of a long wool skirt and thought of her patient, Miss Irene, who had tripped on her own hem walking down her front steps. At 85, a fall could change everything. Helen smiled gently at the memory and made her decision. She laid out 3 boxes. Keep, donate, discard. Her rule: if she hadn't worn it in a year, if it didn't fit comfortably, or if it took more than 3 seconds to decide, out it went. She kept what made her feel comfortable and safe: sweaters that hugged her softly, shoes with good soles, and simple, elegant outfits that felt like home. Letting go of clothing, she realized, was not about style. It was about safety and dignity, making the kitchen safer. Helen's kitchen had always been her sanctuary. The scent of ginger tea, the click of the gas stove, the clink of dishes in warm water. It was where she had cooked for her husband, her children, and later her grandchildren. But now, as her hands grew a little stiffer and her balance a little less steady, she saw the kitchen through new eyes. She remembered a patient named Doris, who had burned her hand trying to lift a heavy cast-iron pot. And another man, Arthur, who had slipped on a splash of water near the sink. Helen knew the risks were real. So she pulled out every drawer and cabinet, checking each item. She tossed old spices, expired cans, and the massive roasting pan she hadn't used in over a decade. Out went the heavy cast iron pan, replaced with a lighter aluminum one. She added rubber grips under her cutting board, stuck anti-slip mats near the sink, and placed the items she used most at waist level. Her kitchen felt lighter, safer, and somehow more welcoming. The burden of keepsakes. Perhaps the hardest part came with the sentimental items. Helen sat in her study surrounded by boxes of letters, faded photographs, and childhood mementos. She found her son's third-grade art project, her daughter's dance shoes, a pressed flower from her late husband's funeral. These were not junk. These were the anchors of her life. But she also remembered visiting homes where the memories had become clutter, piles of boxes that no one could navigate, dusty collections that children dreaded sorting after a parent passed. She didn't want that for her own kids. So she chose a new path. She would photograph the most meaningful items and store the images in a digital album with captions. Then she selected a handful of keepsakes to keep in a beautiful wooden box, just enough to hold in her lap, just enough to stir memories, not overwhelm them. Each item she let go of made space for clarity. She didn't lose her memories. She honored them by choosing what to carry forward. Part 2. Decluttering beyond the physical. The sun streamed through the lace curtains of Helen's living room, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon polish, remnants of her morning cleaning. She sat down with a cup of tea and a quiet mind, but she knew her work wasn't finished. Decluttering, she had come to realize, wasn't just about the physical space. It extended far deeper, into relationships, routines, habits, and even the invisible clutter of thoughts. These could weigh heavier than any pile of clothing or stack of paper. She had learned this not just from patients, but from her own life. After her husband passed away 5 years ago, the silence had been both comforting and deafening. Friends drifted, some unsure of what to say, others lost in their own struggles. In that solitude, Helen began reevaluating not just what she kept in her home, but what she allowed into her life, letting go of draining relationships. There was a time when Helen believed every relationship was worth preserving, even difficult ones, especially difficult ones. She would pick up calls she didn't want to answer, attend social gatherings out of obligation, and exchange pleasantries with people who left her feeling smaller than before. But over the years, especially as she worked with dying patients, she heard the same regrets over and over. I wish I hadn't wasted so much time on people who didn't make me feel good. That line struck a chord. Helen thought of her old college roommate, Patricia, who called every few weeks, always to complain, to criticize, to gossip. After every call, Helen felt drained. Not angry, not sad, just hollow. She realized it wasn't helping either of them. So one afternoon, Helen made a decision. She gently told Patricia she needed to step back and prioritize peace in her life. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet, calm, and clear. In the weeks that followed, the silence left by that absence was filled with something new. Relief. Instead of feeling guilty, she felt light. She made space for people who made her laugh, who respected her boundaries, who shared the joys of aging without bitterness or fear. Filtering out the noise. Every morning, Helen used to read the news, several outlets in fact. She subscribed to newsletters, health magazines, even followed wellness influencers. But over time, all this information began to feel overwhelming. She remembered one afternoon in particular, sitting on the porch with her neighbor Marianne, who was frantically describing a new anti-aging supplement she'd read about online. They say it reverses cognitive decline, Marianne had exclaimed. Helen smiled kindly but said nothing. She'd heard this before. Dozens of times, in fact. For every article touting the next miracle cure, she knew a dozen patients who had wasted time and money chasing false hope. That evening, Helen unsubscribed from half her email lists. She cancelled 3 magazine subscriptions and deleted several bookmarked websites. Now, she followed only a handful of trusted sources. Her doctor, a local health bulletin, and a few publications that brought her peace, not panic. She had learned to ask herself one simple question before consuming any information. Does this actually help me live better today? Most of the time the answer was no. Reclaiming her time. One of Helen's biggest realizations came when she reviewed how she spent her days. There were small rituals that brought joy, watering her herbs, calling her grandchildren, reading novels. But there were also habits she had held onto out of duty. For instance, Helen still cooked elaborate meals twice a week, even though she lived alone. She mopped the kitchen floor every evening. She handwrote thank you cards even when a quick call would suffice. These things weren't wrong. They were lovely in their way. But were they necessary? Helen remembered a patient, Mr. Donovan, who had kept his routine so rigid that he had no time for pleasure. "I haven't sat on my porch in years," he once confessed. Always something to do. So Helen asked herself a hard question. What are the things I'm doing because I feel I have to, not because they bring me joy? The answer was clear. She scaled back her cooking, switching to simple, nourishing meals. She cleaned only once or twice a week, and not always perfectly. And she allowed herself to nap in the afternoon without guilt. That extra time, she used it to take slow walks at the park, call her sister in Oregon, or sit by the window with a book and a slice of apple pie. The joy she found in those quiet hours was worth more than any spotless kitchen. Learning the art of letting go. Perhaps the hardest shift of all was not physical or relational, but spiritual. Letting go of control. Letting go of perfection. Letting go of the fear of decline. Aging, Helen had come to understand, was not a steady unraveling. It was a slow unfolding. The question wasn't how to stop it, but how to meet it with grace. She recalled a visit with Mrs. Lang, a vibrant 82-year-old widow who had sold her 4-bedroom house and moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment in a senior co-op. When Helen asked if she missed her garden or her antiques, Mrs. Lang shook her head. "I thought I would," she said. "But honestly, feel free. It's like I can finally breathe." That word stuck with Helen, breathe. We carry so many things, possessions, expectations, responsibilities, that we forget what it feels like to move freely through life. Every time she chose to release something, an object, an obligation, a worn-out belief, Helen found she could breathe a little easier. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes she cried while letting go of something deeply tied to her past. But the tears didn't mean regret. They meant release. The unexpected gifts of less. Decluttering, Helen realized, had begun with paper and pans. But now it was a philosophy. A way of living. She laughed more easily. Slept more soundly. Her home, once dense with memory and maintenance, felt like a refuge. It didn't matter that it wasn't grand or trendy. It was hers. And it reflected who she was now, not who she used to be. Even her children noticed the change. When they visited, they no longer had to step around boxes or dig through drawers. They sat with her in the sunroom, played cards, made tea. There was space to connect. One afternoon, her daughter Lucy said softly, "You seem lighter, Mom. Happier." Helen smiled. That's what happens when you stop carrying things you no longer need. Part 3. The beauty of empty spaces. Autumn arrived quietly. Golden leaves fluttered down onto Helen's porch as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She sipped her tea slowly, savoring the stillness. It had been nearly a year since she started her intentional decluttering of old age. What began as a practical task, sorting papers and tidying drawers, had become a gentle revolution in how she lived, thought, and felt. Helen had discovered something profound. The emptier her space became, the more full her life felt. Holding on to meaning, not objects. Of course, not everything was easy to let go of. In the corner of her bedroom stood a small carved chest. It was the only piece she hadn't sorted through. Inside were keepsakes. A faded wedding photo, her children's baby shoes, her husband's college ring, a handful of postcards from her parents. For months, she hadn't dared open it. One rainy afternoon, she finally sat down before the chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. The scent of old paper and cedar wafted up. She sorted through the contents slowly, tenderly. Some items made her smile. Others brought quiet tears. But instead of clinging to everything, she made a new choice. She photographed the most meaningful items, wrote a few notes about each one, and created a small album, light enough to hold in one hand, rich enough to hold a lifetime. She kept a few real objects: her husband's ring, one of Lucy's baby shoes, and a letter from her father. The rest, she placed back in the chest, closed the lid, and donated it to a local memory archive project that helped seniors preserve their stories. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant honoring the past without being bound to it. One drawer, one step at a time. Helen often reminded others that the process of decluttering, whether physical or emotional, should never feel overwhelming. It wasn't about achieving a perfect home or a minimalist lifestyle. It was about liberating space, both around you and inside you. Start with one drawer, she told a friend who was struggling. Just one. Keep only what brings peace. Let go of what brings pressure. That advice worked better than any complicated checklist. One drawer led to another. One unnecessary obligation let go created time for something meaningful. One filtered news source replaced with a poem changed the tone of her morning. There was a kind of magic in starting small. The gift of peaceful aging. Helen began to notice subtle changes. She no longer rushed through her days. Her movements slowed, but with purpose. Mornings were spent in quiet reflection. Afternoons were reserved for visits, calls, books, and walks. Friends who used to dread aging came to her for advice. "How are you so content?" they asked. Helen smiled. "I made room for what matters. That's all." She encouraged others to consider aging not as a loss of vitality, but as an opportunity to reframe life. "You don't need more," she said. "You need less, so the important things can breathe." One of her patients, a retired teacher named Mr. Daniels, took her advice to heart. He donated half of his book collection to a school, freed up a room in his house to create an art studio, and finally began painting again at 76. When Helen visited, he beamed. "It's like I got a second life." Creating room for joy. As Helen's own home grew simpler, her days grew richer. Her closets held only clothes she loved. Soft sweaters, easy pants, and a few pieces that made her feel dignified and comfortable. No more itchy fabrics or items that reminded her of weight she used to wear. Her kitchen was pared down to just what she used. A light aluminum pot, one favorite mug, a wooden spoon her granddaughter had carved. No more clutter, no more chaos. Most importantly, her time belonged to her. She painted again. Soft landscapes of the coast she had visited in her youth. She rejoined a local storytelling circle at the library. She wrote small essays about memory and aging, some of which found their way into local newsletters. She spent more time outdoors, feeding birds, watching the wind move through the trees, admiring how gracefully nature embraced change. The gentle philosophy of enough. There came a day when Helen stood in her living room and looked around, not for things to remove, but to simply take in the space she had created. There was air, there was light, there was peace. She thought about how much of her life had been spent accumulating: degrees, possessions, habits, social obligations. But in these later years, the most profound growth had come from releasing. She had discovered what she called the gentle philosophy of enough. It meant accepting her body, even with its aches. It meant treasuring her past, without living inside it. It meant not chasing what was gone or fearing what was to come. Helen wasn't trying to be young again. She was trying to be fully alive at the age she was. An invitation to others. As word of her approach spread, neighbors and even distant acquaintances reached out. One morning, a woman named Clara knocked on her door. She was in her late 60s, newly widowed, and overwhelmed by the house she had shared with her husband for 40 years. "I heard what you've been doing," Clara said, nervously holding a notebook. "Could you help me start?" Helen invited her in for tea. Together they made a plan, not a rigid list but a gentle path. One drawer, one photo album, one unnecessary obligation, one memory honored, one burden released. Weeks later, Clara returned. Her eyes were brighter. "I feel like I can breathe again," she said. "I didn't know how much I was carrying." Helen nodded. She knew exactly what she meant. Closing thoughts. The empty shelf. In her study, Helen had an empty shelf. Not for lack of books but by design. It reminded her that she didn't need to fill every space, physically or emotionally. Some shelves were meant to stay open, waiting for what life might still offer. Sometimes she placed a single flower there. Or a note from her granddaughter. Or nothing at all. It was a space for possibility. To Helen, that shelf said more than any diploma or photo ever could. "I've made room for the future and for joy." The final message. To anyone facing the autumn of life, Helen had this to offer. Decluttering your life, your home, your mind, your relationships, is not about erasing your history. It's about clearing the way for what still lies ahead. Start small. One drawer. One paper. One yes to something you love. And one no to something that drains you. Over time, the space you create will fill with something beautiful. Peace, clarity, and freedom. And in that quiet space, you will rediscover not just your belongings, but yourself. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video to let us know you cared. Share it with friends or loved ones who may find comfort and inspiration in these words. Comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your own experiences, or how you're creating space for peace in your life. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel Senior Health for more gentle stories, helpful tips, and heartfelt advice for living well in your golden years. Together, let's build a warm and caring community where every season of life is cherished.